Welcome back to the home of straight-talking British politics, where we cut through the spin and get to what's really going on in the UK. I'm Jack.
And I'm Olivia, and today we're talking about net zero energy policy and whether Britain is charging headfirst into an economic mess in the name of saving the planet.
Because that really is the heart of it, isn't it? We're told the story is simple. Climate change is an emergency, the planet is at risk, and unless we slash carbon emissions immediately, we're heading towards a disaster within our lifetimes, or at least within our children's.
And from that comes the policy response: transition rapidly to renewable energy, push towards net zero, and do whatever it takes to get there.
But here's where the argument starts to wobble. Because when people are asked in polls whether they support action on climate change, of course, many say yes, but ask them how much they personally want to pay for it, and suddenly the answers get a lot smaller.
Exactly. In principle, people support cleaner energy and a better environment, but once that support turns into higher energy bills, more expensive goods, and fears over jobs and industry, it becomes a very different conversation.
And critics say that's because the real cost hasn't always been presented honestly. People are told their bills are going up because of wars, instability, and global markets, and that's partly true, but they're not always told how much government policy, levies, and green targets are adding to the pressure as well.
Which means many people support the idea without realizing how much of the bill they may already be paying.
And that takes us to one of the biggest criticisms of Britain's current approach. The UK only accounts for a tiny proportion of global emissions. So, the argument goes, even if Britain drove its emissions to zero tomorrow morning, it would barely shift the global dial.
And more than that, some critics say our current policies don't even reduce global emissions properly, they just move them somewhere else.
That's the real sting in the tail. If energy becomes too expensive here, industry doesn't disappear, it relocates. Steel-making, manufacturing, heavy industry, it goes abroad. Usually to countries with dirtier energy, weaker standards, and longer shipping routes.
So Britain gets to boast about cutting domestic emissions while still importing the very same products from overseas, often with a bigger carbon footprint attached.
Exactly. We close the factory, lose the jobs, weaken the economy, then buy the same stuff back from the other side of the world, and somehow we're supposed to clap for that.
Steel is probably the clearest example. If you stop making it here, you still need it. So you bring it in from abroad, often from countries using more polluting energy, and then transport it halfway around the world on ships burning dirty fuel.
Which means you're not solving the problem, you're just exporting it. And on top of that, you're hammering your own workers and your own industrial base.
That's why some people call it virtue signalling. Britain still consumes, still builds, still imports, still uses the products. We're just pretending we're cleaner because somebody else now does the dirty part.
And now there's another layer being added to all this: carbon border taxes. The idea is that imported goods made with higher emissions will be taxed when they come into the country.
Which may sound logical on paper, but in practice it could push prices up across the board.
Because what goods are we talking about? Potentially everything: steel, cars, concrete, clothes, imported materials, even green technology like turbines and solar panels.
So if the economy isn't already fragile enough, that kind of policy risks making daily life even more expensive.
And then we hit the deeper question. How have so many political leaders become so committed to a model that critics say is clearly punishing the public and undermining British industry?
One answer is that climate politics has stopped being treated as a practical engineering challenge and started being treated more like a moral belief system. Once people believe they're acting to save the planet, they can end up justifying almost anything in the process.
And yet, the reality is stubborn. For all the targets and declarations, the world still overwhelmingly runs on fossil fuels. The energy system we all depend on has not been transformed nearly as fast as politicians talk about it.
And that matters because reliable, affordable energy is the backbone of everything: heating homes, powering hospitals, moving goods, running factories, cooking food. Modern life depends on it.
And the critic's case is simple. If you haven't yet found a replacement that's just as reliable and just as affordable, Forcing people away from the old system before the new one is truly ready is asking for trouble.
And not just here in Britain either. Around the world, access to modern energy can mean the difference between health and illness, safety and danger, opportunity and poverty.
Which is why some say the debate has to be about trade-offs, not slogans. Yes, take climate risk seriously, but also take seriously the damage being done right now if policies are driving up costs, weakening industry, and making countries more dependent on imports.
And from there comes a very different policy approach. Instead of building everything around hard deadlines, some argue that governments should stop trying to force a finish line and start focusing on breakthrough technologies.
That means serious investment in things that could actually solve the problem properly. Advanced nuclear, small modular reactors, fusion, better storage, smarter grids, and genuinely scalable low-carbon energy that people can afford.
Because if one of those technologies matures faster than expected, then governments that spent decades forcing expensive short-term fixes might end up looking spectacularly short-sighted.
And politically, the pressure is building. We've already seen more tension between governments and the workers, unions, and industries that feel they're being sacrificed in the process.
Because for communities built around refining, steel, manufacturing, engineering, automotive work, and heavy industry, this isn't abstract. These are livelihoods, skills, local economies, and generations of industrial heritage.
And when those jobs go, they don't just magically reappear as green jobs down the road. That promise gets made a lot more often than it gets delivered.
The car industry is another flashpoint. Car makers are being told to sell more electric vehicles, but many customers are still not convinced. Concerns over charging infrastructure, cost, depreciation, reliability, and convenience are still very real.
So, businesses are being squeezed between government targets and consumer reality. And when those two things don't line up, it's workers who usually end up paying the price.
Which is why more and more critics say the current version of net zero isn't simply environmental policy, it's deindustrialization with nicer branding.
And oil and gas are another battleground, because even many official projections show that Britain will still be using oil and gas for years, even decades to come.
So the obvious question is this. If we're still going to need it, why would we choose to import more of it instead of producing what we can ourselves?
Especially when importing liquefied natural gas is often far more carbon intensive. It has to be extracted, liquefied, shipped, unloaded, and converted back before use. That is a long, expensive, emission-heavy chain.
And it also raises serious questions about energy security. A country that weakens its own domestic energy base becomes more exposed when the world gets unstable.
So, the alternative being pushed by critics is what they call energy abundance. Not scarcity, not forced rationing through price. Abundance. Cheap, reliable, secure energy. Produced here where possible and backed by a practical mix of sources.
That would mean being realistic about oil and gas, more serious about nuclear, supportive of renewables where they work, and much less ideological about the whole thing.
It would also mean recognizing that energy policy is economic policy. If electricity is expensive, everything gets more expensive. If industry can't compete, jobs go. If households are struggling to heat their homes, then something is badly wrong.
And that's where there may actually be more common ground than people think. Plenty of people want cleaner energy and lower emissions, but they also want secure jobs, lower bills, and a transition that doesn't feel like punishment.
Exactly. The public isn't against clean energy. What they're against is being told to pay more, drive less, eat differently, and lower their standard of living while politicians pretend that's all painless progress.
And that's where the politics gets dangerous, because once people start to feel that climate policy is really about control, restriction, and telling them how to live, support begins to crumble.
And once support crumbles, the backlash begins.
So perhaps the real lesson is this. If governments want public support for long-term change, they have to prove they're acting in the public interest. That means honesty about costs, seriousness about jobs, and a much more practical approach to energy.
Because if they don't, voters will conclude that net zero isn't a route to prosperity, it's a route to decline.
And when enough people believe that, the whole political consensus starts to crack.
And that is when things get very interesting indeed.
That's all for today.
Thanks for listening, and we look forward to next time. Please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. It really helps more people find the channel and supports what we're building here.
See you next time.